Today I'm here with Hacsi Horvath. Did I say it correctly?
That's the
Close
Hungarian
enough.
style. Yep, yep.
Okay. And Hacsi, I'm really thankful that you have been willing to come out and talk about your experience because I think it's really important. And for those who don't know, you lived as a woman for a number of years, had medical interventions, and I wonder if you could just kind of tell people what your experience was.
So I was born in 1959, and I was kind of introverted. I was very introverted and very kind of bookish as a small child. Um, and I did not like the stereotypic boys stuff that much, playing blah, 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 sports, blah, 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 but just being little, 5, 6, whatever. I did have a little friend who was a girl from across the street. She was my friend, and we used to play games, watch TV, whatever, back in the day. And so with stereotypes firmly being impressed, it made me feel like I'm not suitable to be a boy, and that maybe I should be a girl. So this was a vague idea that I had as a young boy that was a bit introverted and bookish and not stereotypically masculine. And when I got older, we moved from a little suburban lifestyle. We moved to California, and at the height of the summer of love and all that stuff. And things got really crazy. And my mother ended up with some abusive men. And so I started having male violence was part of my life. And so then as I got older, I thought, I don't want to be a man. Mm-hmm. No way, And meanwhile, I did continue to emerge as a sort of athletic young man, straight, I still thought somehow I was going to grow up to be a woman somehow. And of course, we had no information about what any of that meant. I was just free-forming in my mind. And then I became a father at age 19, and I kind of put it all behind me. I said, look, this is silly. I'm not going to do that. And in my 20s, I read Janice Raymond and Mary Daly. And so I started coming to a realization about this stuff. Like, okay, so this whole transvestism, transsexualism, the only terms I'd ever seen anywhere, because, really there's not even books, and we didn't even have books in those days. So I reached a certain level of peace. Like, all right, I can just wear whatever I want. It doesn't mean anything. It's cool. And so really it was fine. And I was a single father for many years. And then my son left home, and I had a variety of difficult situations, a couple of bad breakups in a relatively short period of time. And I was really depressed and self-pitying. And I had internet at home for the first time. And then I started, this is 99, and started reading like all this stuff, like, these GeoCities pages about trans. And I was like, whoa. And I was feeling so sorry for myself that I got myself ruminating about, like, wow, this might be good. This might be a way to get out of my problems. I've been a failure as a man, blah, blah, blah.
Well, and I think it's really helpful to have that background because, the issues of not being a gender conforming boy, I hear from men who grow up and have these issues. And then seeing that male violence, I could see it being very traumatic for a kid, and definitely thinking, boy, I don't want to be like that. If that's your male role model, no wonder you're kind of like, I don't want to be a guy.
Yeah. The men I was around were either, they were mostly just kind of artistic or just, drug dealers, or they were violent, or they were just sort of, nice people, but not really imprinting on me as my father was back east and so forth. And so anyway, yeah, and I would say that in my mind, I was not conforming because I was like, oh, I don't like this boy stuff. But all the same, I was surfing all the time, and sort of not. My best friend was a girl, so I thought, oh, my best friend's a girl, so that's important. Blah blah blah. All these stereotypic stupid things were how my developing mind, kind of integrated the idea of. I didn't even think in terms of gender at all. I just thought, I don't like being a man. I don't want to be a man. So, anyway.
Did you experience any abuse or any trauma as well? I'm thinking if you were in that environment.
Yes. So I had a lot of trauma. I have complex PTSD. because of, we had a, well, if anything that, if you can imagine anything that could have gone wrong in the late 60s and early 70s in the San Francisco Bay Area, in terms of kids and what they were around and so forth, we had that.
And I actually can imagine that, because I was in the same situation with a single mother who was in the movement. And we
Yes.
had, you know, all kinds of people over all the time, drugs,
Yes.
sex, alcohol. So
Yes.
I imagine if you were experiencing similar to what I experienced, it was
Yeah.
a very unsafe environment for children.
We sold our house in 1971 and took a freighter across the ocean and went to Indonesia, where we essentially got deported after 3 months. And I mean, just that kind of thing. I was the oldest of 6.
Oh,
So I was always trying to like manage and control and fix and all that stuff, and shoplifting groceries, you know, back home in Bolinas, and just, you know, turning the electricity back on after it had been turned off by using secret methods, and just being like having to, I don't know if any of this should go in there, specifics like this, but yeah, so yeah. So you
sounds like
hear
there
me,
was
I
just
hear
a
you.
lot of stress. I mean, just an
Just
extreme amount of
incredible. And so, yeah. And then I got thrown across the room by one big guy, you know, and just a lot of, you know, my mother had her ribs broken right in front of me by this guy beating her up, and just a lot of undesirable sort of things
And
happening,
so,
as you
so
can
you
imagine.
talk about wanting to masquerade as a woman. What I hear, and maybe it's because I'm like empathizing with you a lot, but I hear someone who has had a very difficult life wanting to find a more comfortable way of living, and sort of
Right.
trying to find something that would allow you to become a different person. Is that accurate?
Yes, but what was happening in the late 90s, because as I say, up to that time, I'd sort of, you know, having read Janice Raymond and Mary Daly and sort of understanding the ways that transsexualism harms women on a huge scale, um, that was my consciousness raising about it. And I was in my 20s at that time. So years went by, and so I was 39 or 40 by the time in late 99 or so. I was feeling very sorry for myself and had internet at home for the first time, and I was learning all about transgenderism, transsexualism, transvestism, which all had been very vague. There was no information. There were no books in the library. We didn't have the internet. So here I was with the internet for the first time, sort of becoming immersed in all that, and then starting to ruminate about maybe it would be better for me. You know, I was sort of idealizing becoming a woman, so-called, and disavowing everything of my life as a man and saying I've just been a terrible failure and it's just been awful. And really it had not been so awful. I was just really, really depressed and feeling very sorry for myself. And so although I had read Janice Raymond and Mary Daly, I thought to myself, you know what, this is all right in theory, but me, I'm suffering, blah, 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 and feeling very sorry for myself. And so it was an escapist thing. So yes, I'd had a lot of trauma, but actually I had a lot of strength. I had a lot of resilience and coping.
Mhm.
It's just that I was feeling sorry for myself and feeling very down, and saw this as an escape route. And so I was aware that it was not the principled way to go. I just thought, it'll be all right. I won't harm anybody. I'm a nice person. I don't mean anybody harm. I'm not going to do anything bad or anything. I'm just me. I'm just having a hard time. I just want my life to be easier. And so it seemed that it's not that I completely disavowed my life, my male life as Hacsi or any of that. It was, I sort of suppressed it. I just didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to start something new. And so I moved from Marin County into San Francisco,
Mhm.
and I got a job at UCSF. And it was sort of a platform for me to sort of have a lifestyle as a loner, workaholic person. And that's really what I did. And I had virtually no social life. My community was really just my colleagues at UCSF. I would go out maybe once a year or something at the insistence of a friend from work. And I never went back to Bolinas. I changed everything about my life. I didn't have a vehicle. I stopped surfing. You know, I just wanted to be a workaholic, middle-aged lady,
Kind of just
so-called,
reinvent yourself.
and reinvent myself and not really do anything except work. And that, as a strategy, that worked really well in my career. I did very, very well in a reasonably short or a ridiculously short period of time. I went from being like the second lowest administrative assistant up to a member of the faculty.
Oh, wow.
With a master's in English, and I was a lecturer in epidemiology and biostatistics.
Oh, wow.
So it's because I was such a workaholic. I worked basically every day, and was always offering to help people with stuff. And so they could see that I could write, which is an important skill, and always was willing to help do stuff and stay up late and whatever was needed to be done. And that worked really well for me in terms of my career. But I paid no attention whatsoever to anything trans. I didn't follow any trans, I have to say, in quote marks, trans developments in their activism. I didn't know any of them. I knew a few of them by sight from around the office or in the elevator. Hello, you know, that kind of thing. But I didn't hang out with any of them, and I didn't have the community of trans or any of that shit. I just was just on my own. And
So
I
at
had
this
my
point,
work
were
colleague.
you just cross-dressing, or had you started
Okay.
medical intervention?
Yeah, so the first year, so let me back up just a little bit. So when I was ruminating about how good it would be, how much better it would be to be a woman, I wondered what I would do next. And what happened was, during the process, I think this is consistent with everybody who's getting into trans ideation. And I've heard this corroborated from some of the detransitioned people. Several of the young women have said, yes, that's how it was with me. Don't know if that's true for everyone, but others have corroborated this process. And for me, it was just having this idea that it might be possible to change sex, or to be, if not, I didn't really believe it was changing sex, but to be, that it was acceptable to present myself in that guise. And ruminating about it incessantly, thinking endlessly about it, reading everything I could, and sort of imagining myself, who would I be if I were a woman? And this is sort of cultivating a split persona. Yeah. And it's actually kind of classic from psychoanalysis. I think this is a really useful realization from back in the old days, is through this process of rumination and cultivation of an opposite sex persona, you split at a certain point when you realize this might be feasible for me to do. Mm-hmm. And the second persona then takes over, and my real self kind of takes a back seat, takes a nap in the back seat of the car while the new persona is driving.
And that makes sense if you've had trauma, because those of us who have experienced childhood trauma have that ability to disassociate anyway. And I don't know if you had that ability anyway, but I know that was, that's something that a lot of children who have been through trauma, that's just something they do without even, it's just an automatic response. And if you are able to disassociate, then that ability to move into that, split into another persona is that much easier.
And what's interesting is this other persona is rather giddy. And that's why you have all these people with their trans masquerading are so impertinent and they're so rude. They're just giddy. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of how I was. I talked to everyone constantly about blah, 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 about me. It was this hyper narcissistic phase, which then kind of settled down as I thought, okay, this is okay. But how I got into that space, the place where the splitting occurs, I believe, is the moment you realize this is feasible for me to do. Now, back in those days, there was a certain gatekeeping process that the doctors, at least in principle, were supposed to, be careful and talk to you a lot, make you go to a therapist and do all kinds of stuff. And before they would give you any hormones, let alone surgery and so forth. But in my case, I realized, because I thought, I just want to do this without taking hormones. I want to take herbs. these kind of phytoestrogenic herbs that really have no impact at all, but I didn't know that. And then I realized I have no gatekeeper, and then I'm just going to do this. And that's when the splitting happened. It's like, wow, I'm just going now. And next thing you know, I'm telling everybody my name is Tara, and
What
telling
was
my
your
family
name?
and friends. I said my name was Tara,
Tara. Okay.
which was, I chose that name because of the Bodhisattva Tara in Buddhism, but also it means crossing over. It was some sort of symbolic idea I had. And it was just, everyone, of course, was very kind and very sort of enabling. I don't want to make it like it's their fault, but everyone was like, oh, wow, are you really sure? And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm saying, yes, of course, I'm really sure. Of course I am. And within a few months, I was working at UCSF, and I thought, this is great. This is just what I want, just to fit myself into a groove and just be part of that. And then I really did not come back to my home stomping grounds at all. I was just over in the city. And I just persevered from there. So in terms of the medical stuff, after about maybe a year or a little bit less, I thought, well, this is working out for me very well. So, I mean, I was just very pleased with myself, and I was not receiving any resistance. Everyone was very friendly and kind, and I thought, well, this is really working out. I like this. I'm feeling better than I was before. And so I asked my doctor for estrogen, and she just quickly wrote a prescription. There was I didn't have any sort of baseline testing at all, which I think would have been really useful. I think because it would have probably shown all my endocrine system was cortisol and everything was crazy from way back. Or at least maybe it would have shown I had low testosterone, perhaps. I don't know. It would have been worth checking, but no, prescription. And from then on, it was like, wow, I think this is a great way forward. And after about another year, I said, the dose was rather small. And I said, could I have a larger dose? Just because I was reading a little bit about it, like maybe I should have a larger dose. I don't know. And she just doubled it right there.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
sure. And so I wasn't going to have any surgery. I felt no need for it. I thought, and really because I sort of resist medical intervention. That's why I didn't want to take estrogen in the first place. But I did not research anything about the possible harms of taking estrogen for many years. I actually didn't want to know, but even though I'm working in a medical environment and public health, I did not even look. So for me, it was just like this little tiny pill. It couldn't, although it's changing my body, it couldn't have that many bad effects. I can't think of what they might be, So that to me seemed like a little small thing because it's quite a small pill. I thought, no big deal. Probably doesn't have any harms. I don't know. I just didn't want to know. And I wasn't going to have any surgery. But then about 9 years into the whole thing, around 2009, UCSF made it part of their health plan to have any kind of trans surgeries. Now, that should not have really affected me, but the thing was, I'd been traveling overseas about twice a year for work, at least once a year for work. And each time, so after the first time in 2003 or so, I had a male passport from several years earlier, and I said, can I change this to a female passport? And they said, no, you have to have surgery. And I said, I don't want to. And they said, well, we'll give it to you for 1 year. So I had a series of these 1 year female passports. And then after several years, they said, all right, this is the last time. We're not going to do it again. You have to have the surgery. And so right then came UCSF's announcement that they were going to cover this. And so this is really the stupidest reason ever to have surgery, because then I can have a F passport. How stupid. But I thought, well, I'm not going to change back or anything. This is like, I can't even, it's just can't even be imagined that I would change back ever. This is working out really well. I have a quiet, simple life of just workaholism, and it's okay. So I'm going to do this. And so I had a orchiectomy, testicles removed. And at the time, I thought, wow, this was really a great decision. This is really fine. I mean, it didn't really change anything. I don't know if it did. Maybe it did. Maybe maybe it sort of intensified the estrogen effects in my body, which already had resulted in rather large breasts due to genetics, and of course, redistribution of body fat. I had already had laser hair removal of my face. I never had very much facial hair. I never even shaved until I was 28 years old. So it was always just rather sparse. And then I thought, I'm just going to get rid of it just so that I don't have to think about it. So all that had already been done by the time I had the surgery, even the large breasts. So I don't know, maybe the estrogen effect intensified even more. And I thought this was really great. I thought, this is really fine. I'm glad I did this. It's perfect. I'm in the groove now. My career is going perfectly well, and I'm quite happy with everything. But then something changed. And that is, after 13 years, an old friend from Marin County looked me up on Facebook, and I had not seen her in about 20 years. Now, she knew about my current situation. I knew that she would probably disapprove. But she was very kind in her note to me, and I said, well, let's go have lunch. So we met up for lunch, and she was very kind and very friendly. And I thought, well, this is nice. I did maintain a few friendships from before, but we mostly would see each other or email each other or occasionally phone each other. But I began to see her every couple of weeks. I would go over to Marin County, and we would just hang out and go for a walk and stuff like that, And after a little while, she said, I'm worried about you taking that estrogen, because of course she's very on top of health. And I was just trying to ignore it, I'm worried about you. You could have a stroke. There's quite a lot of evidence that males taking estrogen have a greatly elevated risk of stroke. So I really wish you would stop taking it. You don't need it anymore. You're fully developed. You don't need it. And at first I resisted, because in a way it was, taking the estrogen was sort of like a magic spell or something, or like a little magic potion or something. I was afraid that if I stopped taking it, I would revert. This is not scientific. I just thought I would revert to my old kind of self. It was just sort of magical thinking that I don't want to stop. But then she kept urging me to stop taking it. I said, all right, I'm going to stop taking it. And a few days later, now mind you, I had this kind of hyper feminine stereotypic insanity going on. I had perfect nails all the time. I was always shopping. I had all kinds of hyper feminine gear and cosmetics and all kinds of nonsense. And I was, really it was just like a hobby, because of course I'd never really gotten into it till I was 40 years old. It wasn't my training as a child to get into this or to be pretty or any of that stuff. It was just some sort of like hobby that I picked up at 40. And it was just something I did, and I felt okay about it, because I thought, I just want to kind of fit the stereotype of middle-aged academic worker lady. That's my bird squeaking. So that was just my sort of lifestyle. That's all it really was. And so one morning, several days after I stopped taking the estrogen, I woke up and I felt very uneasy. It was Saturday or Sunday, I don't remember, but I had planned to go get my nails done, and I was going to go look for some boots or something, and just a typical, stereotypical feminine weekend day in the city. And I felt, this is really weird. I think this is, why would I even be doing any of this stuff? This is not my life. This is, it was as if I had something, I suddenly was feeling very critical about the whole femininity, let alone hyper femininity of the whole thing, and I thought, this is really weird. I don't think I should really do this. And so it began a process for me of the first time critically engaging with, what the hell am I doing? I mean, I'd had little floating ideas of like, I don't know why I'm doing all this stuff, but it was okay. But for the first time, I was examining it with really a critical eye, and yet not critical enough. I began to write a lot and just think and wonder what am I doing? And what I initially thought I would do was tone it down quite a bit and just be androgynous, which I know is a completely phony thing, but it's just the Dionysian mindfuck of women, of just like, oh, I'm just androgynous, don't mind me, and meanwhile undermining them all the while, So at first I thought I would just do that, and I would not change anything in terms of people calling me Tara, in terms of using the ladies' room, whatever. It was just a way of dialing back some of the hyperfemininity. And I just wasn't sure really where I was going to go with it. I could have actually gone back into the way it was. I was just examining it. But then after about 6 weeks, I was reading the internet, and I encountered the blogs of some of the radical feminists, the Gender Trender blog, and a few others that were very important at the time. And to my astonishment, I learned that children were being transed. And I really had no idea. I wasn't following anything about any of that stuff. Just was the last thing on my mind. And on top of that, I learned that the males were extremely violent and rude and nasty to any woman who just questioned anything about it, the transing of anybody, and about men coming and going as they please in women's spaces, and that these men had just this intense reaction, which I later learned was narcissistic rage. And I thought to myself right on that day, August 27th, 2013, I don't want anything to do with this.
Wow.
And I was already in the so-called androgynous stage, wearing blue jeans and flannel shirts, just like the old days, just like there's actually no difference. In fact, my hair was about maybe as long as it is now. I had it, it had been very long, but I thought, oh, I'll have a short haircut. It'd be cool, and really I looked just like I do now, pretty much. And like I had used to look back in the old days. And I was thinking, what am I even doing? What am I even doing? I'm just look like my old self. I'm just a guy wearing jeans and flannel who says he's a woman. The clothes is not important. It took me a little bit to get around that corner, but the clothes meant nothing. And the presentation of myself meant nothing. It's the reality. Fact is, I'm male. and so I just confronted my arrogance in just thinking it'll be okay. Is the sunshine too bright on my face? Maybe
it's
I should
a little
move
bit bright. I could tell.
I think I didn't realize it was getting that way.
Yeah.
Maybe that's better.
Yeah.
I can turn this a little bit too.
And that to me, it's so interesting to me that it was reading those sort of rad femme websites that really got to you, because I think for a lot of it might have pushed you in the other direction. It had you had a different personality and been like, well, no, I deserve to be in these spaces. But instead you recognized that you were actually, as you said, masquerading as a woman, and maybe had some empathy for what it might be like to be a woman who had to accept men who are masquerading as women.
What I understood was that because I'd had some earlier reading many years earlier, so I understood the perspective they were coming. Suddenly it was all flooding back to me, and I understood where they're coming from. And I was cognizant that even in my arrogance of freely coming and going in women's spaces, that, there were times when I would open a restroom door and a woman's face would have this face of fright.
Mm-hmm.
And I registered that even back then, and then they would quickly make a smile and be okay. I registered it back then, but then I thought, oh, well, but I'm okay. I'm not a mean person. I'm not a bad person. She seemed to get over it. I just sort of minimized her whole thing completely and made it just like she got over it. She's fine now. And that I just did not appreciate in the moment of the violence of a male entering a woman's protected space with all the experiences that women have, which I had been aware of that. I had known this from my earlier reading and just sort of you know, and so here it was, having read these blogs, I started to get all that again. And the first thing I had to recognize after just saying, I'm male, the end of story. The first thing after that was, I have no experience of womanhood. I can't even really say I understand how women have it at all, because even in the height of my masquerading, I was perfectly safe. I wouldn't say perfectly safe, but I was much, much more confident and much more safe to go wandering around at night or something, or anything I wanted to do that would be a normal sort of male thing to do. I think I'll go downtown and get something or whatever, and not have to think about, oh my God, am I going to get jumped? Like every shadow being a possible, rape or murder. For me, it was just like, well, I'm fine. I'll just punch him. If something happens, I'll just break his neck. Just not that I could, but I was like, I could do it. I could probably, And in fact, one time I was, this as an example of sort of my male power. This is maybe 10 or 11 years into my masquerade. I was riding on the streetcar and in San Francisco, and some punkers got on. I think they had a band, I think. And it was early in the morning, but they'd probably been up all night, and they were smoking a little glass pipe on the streetcar. And I don't know what it was crack or speed or whatever, but they were smoking it and blowing it onto the elderly Chinese couple who were there. And I was about 2 seats back. And so I piped up and I said, you guys get off the train. And they said, what? And so then I stood up. And in my purse, I always carried a large pocket knife. Wow. Just because I liked having a knife ever since I was a little boy. I always had a pocket knife, So I go up to these guys with my pocket knife and I hold it up to their face and I say, get off the fucking train.
Wow.
And they went, got right off. And then they were like, yeah, fuck you. And I was like, hold my knife back to them. But I don't think most women would just like get up to 5 guys that are blowing crack or whatever onto some Chinese couple and stand there with a knife and get off the fucking train. Because I was as tall as them, right. 5'10".
Right.
And just, I just had this feeling of like, well, I can't let this just happen. And everyone else is pretending they don't see. And I thought, this is my duty to get up and get them off the train, since I think I can. I feel confident about it. Not that women could do that. It's just maybe, women are sort of trained, like, watch out for this kind of situation. These guys will kill you.
Well, and
I wasn't afraid of them at all.
I mean, I'm 5'1". They would laugh at me. They would laugh at me. If I did that, they would laugh at me.
And I was 5'10". I was probably taller than some of them. Yeah. So it was just like, for me, it was just like immediately a natural thing to do. And it was sort of an almost instinctive thing to do, just as sort of, I don't know. I don't really get into fights or anything, but it was like a bad thing that was happening. Mm-hmm. Whatever crack was being blown on people. And I just felt like, well, I can get up and I have a knife. Yeah. And just do this. So, and I don't know if that's really important, but it's sort of counter women's training to be aware of, careful of men, and I just felt like, oh, I have no problem getting up and telling them to get off the train.
Well, and it kind of illustrates that no matter how much you want to believe, or even do believe that you can appropriate something that you're not, mm-hmm. If you've never lived, if you don't have that lived experience, you cannot even conceptualize what it is. And so you can—
I only have observation. Yeah.
Right. And so you can sort of perform the opposite mm-hmm. gender, which is sort of, this whole idea of gender being performative, but you mm-hmm. can't know what it's like to be the opposite sex. And I think that that's one of the things that I've really just gotten deeply concerned about with the current transgender ideology, is this idea that it's not that you're just deciding to be gender nonconforming and sort of mm-hmm. throwing off the shackles of gender. It's that you can actually become the opposite sex, that yes. that you actually were a woman because you believed you were a woman, even though you had not experienced life as a woman.
I was never so bad that I thought that I actually was a woman. And I'd been persuaded by the by the lies of the angry transvestites on GeoCities websites in the late 90s that woman was sort of a social category, female was biological.
Mm.
So that was I took that and ran with it, that it was all right for me to be a woman, as it was a social convention.
Mm.
Let me take a breath for a second. I hold my breath sometimes. So that I felt that it was sort of a social convention that for whatever reason, it was acceptable for me to enter into that convention. And I knew that it wasn't. As I said, I was aware that I was making an exception for myself. But I was not one of those who loudly bangs on the internet and screams that he's a female, that he's really a woman. I would have easily admitted that I was a man if it had ever come up in conversation, but that I was in the social, but I actually should have known better than to accept this reasoning, but I didn't.
Well, and it's easy for me to understand how you could, during times of trouble, want to escape yourself. And I don't know if you've heard of Richard Hoskin. He's in the UK, and he had sort of a lot of trauma in his life, and sort of at one point decided, I'm a woman now. And the story is very similar to what I hear. He went to even more extremes as far as surgery goes, but it was this sense of just wanting to start over. Like, I'm just gonna wipe the slate clean and start over and be this new person. And it's very understandable why someone with who is suffering from depression, who has a history of trauma, PTSD, would kind of grab that as a saving grace. And my concern is that now we don't have gatekeepers. You didn't have a heck of a lot of a gatekeeper with your doctor, but now we have no gatekeepers. We have kids who can go
on
into
demand
clinics and get it just by saying, this is what I want. And is that why you started speaking out publicly, or did you have other reasons?
Well, so it was August 2013 that I kind of snapped out of the whole situation, and I immediately went to my friend and said, I'm a man and my name's Hacsi and I'm not Tara, and that's over. And so from that day, it was, first there was a process of trying to understand what just happened and reading everything. And so I read those RADFem blogs as my primary source of information, because I quickly found that in the trans pseudoscientific literature, it was all happy stories, and there was really nothing I could get out of that told me anything that would raise. The thing was consciousness raising, so I needed to get very immersed in that. So I read all of that stuff, all the RADFem blogs. I reread Janice Raymond immediately, and all the Gender Trender and several other sites. I just completely devoured all of it and just began to understand what it meant that I had done all this, and how now my returning to non-masquerading was just sort of normal, and nothing. Then I realized quickly that there's no such thing as transition or detransition, that it's just a matter of costume change. And so what I've said to many people is detransition is easy. It's just, are you trying to make people think you're the opposite sex or not? And if you're not, then you've done it. You've detransitioned. It doesn't matter. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it is a mindset of.
Yes.
It was a long time ago when I had what would be considered now gender dysphoria, where I was like, no, I'm a boy, and being very insistent about it, and being very upset when people told me I wasn't, because in my mind, damn it, I'm a boy. And but there, it's a mind shift when you finally say, all right, I got to accept who I am.
Yes, so
I
it
may
took
not
me a
like
little bit,
but this is what I got to accept. Otherwise,
it took me a minute to kind of, it was empowering the first day, but then every day for a few days was a little bit hard, because I had so many habitual things of primping and stuff like that. I'm just like, every time I pass a window looking at, really stupid, hyper feminine stereotypes that I would sort of keep doing for a little while, and just realize I just get back into my body. I just need to walk, also mincing in these little steps, you know. I had to just like be in my body and just like walk in my normal pace and just like move in these ways that maybe are not very feminine or something if I feel like it, just like whatever I'm doing. Go for hikes up hills and down dirt, and just not that it's masculine, but just that it's me, just that it's my life of how I used to be. Start surfing again if I can, you know. It wasn't easy, but really just try to be in my body, regardless of how I look or what I'm doing. Don't even think about how I look. That's a big deal. Living in the city as a fake woman, I was just primping and looking like, ooh, I don't want to get dirty or whatever. All this stupid stuff that was never part of my life until I was 40 years old. And so I had to just sort of relearn, or not even learn, just unlearn all the other nonsense I had piled on top of my usual ordinary human self.
You mentioned
And
like living in your body. And I think that that's something, again, that people with trauma have a hard time doing anyway.
yes,
It's really easy to sort of separate. At least it is for me. And I've heard
yes,
other people say that they experience the same thing, that it's very easy to do that. But it's important to live in your body, because when you
yes.
don't live in your body, you start, well, first of all, you're not a whole person. And
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to get into these really convoluted ways of thinking and do damage to yourself, if you don't acknowledge yourself as sort of a person within who is a body, rather than
Yes.
sort of the separate self from the body.
So for several years, it took me a while to, who knows if I'm even anywhere near where I ought to be, but you know, of course I went through like, okay, now I'm going to be really masculine. And I tried to like be, you know, I got really short hair and I just tried to be sort of, you know, but all the while also I have large breasts and no facial hair. So it was like a losing battle, because I was, you know, people still even now say ma'am, miss, whatever, just because they see and they see no facial hair and put 1 and 6 together and get 3. And anyway, so I had to realize that don't even try to do anything. Just do like my natural self. And I went through a couple of years where I thought, I'm going to have my breasts removed in a surgical process. And, you know, after I started taking testosterone, I thought maybe they'll go away. More magical thinking, but they didn't. I thought, okay, I'll have them removed surgically. And I explored that quite a bit. But I realized that this is just more just mind games, really. This is just who I am. And I no longer have a nice, typically masculine athletic physique as I did when I was, you know, up to 40. But that's the way it is.
And there are men that have breasts. I mean,
yeah, and I mean, I don't even think about them. I just think about in my life, this is just my reality. All I have to do is not lie.
yeah.
That's
Can
all.
you talk a little bit about the process of getting on testosterone? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that, you know, if you've had your testicles removed, you no longer make hormones that your body needs. And these are important hormones. And so it's like, once you make that move, then you are pretty much going to be dependent on external chemicals, external hormones, whether they're estrogen or testosterone, I guess, for the rest of your life. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's there is a little tiny bit of testosterone through the adrenal glands, but it's not enough to do anything at all. It's just there. But in order to, so if you're not taking any hormones, if you're taking estrogen as a man, of course it leads to the risk of stroke and other things, but your bones will be all right. So that will be all right. If you take testosterone and you're a woman and you have no estrogen production, your bones will be all right. You may have other cardiovascular, heart attack, 5 times higher, I think it was, and other risks. So if you're not taking either of them, in my case, I had no normal testosterone. And so after I stopped taking estrogen, I was even more resistant to medicine than ever before. And I wanted just magical thinking just to make it all work, and just for everything to get better, you know. And then I began to research, how does it work if you eat, you know, cruciferous vegetables and that sort of thing. It actually doesn't work anymore if you have your testicles removed, because the mechanism whereby that works is in the testicles. So after about 1.5 years of not taking anything and having no automatic hormone production, I was getting to feel very weepy and kind of fragile. It might have been psychosomatic, but I felt like I don't want to fall down. I'll probably break my arm. I began to feel fragile and very weepy and very emotional. And then I thought I'd better get on some testosterone. And so I did. It was a really stupid process. My doctor, for some reason, thought I should see an endocrinologist with trans experience. Now, this is really stupid, because why? I just have male hypogonadism. I don't need any idiot doctor from the trans industry. But because she had already made an appointment, and it was with this guy at UCSF who's actually a masquerading man himself, who's a man who presents himself as a woman, who's actually quite a high-level doctor at UCSF. Anyway, I went to see him, and I was thinking, oh my God, this is so crazy that I even have to see this person. And I said, yeah, so about 1.5 years ago, I ceased my masquerade. And because I knew I wanted to kind of push at him a little bit. So now I want testosterone. And I didn't let on that I knew who he was, but I still wanted to push him. And he said, well, I don't think that would be advisable.
Really?
He said, I would not give you testosterone until you had been through another, maybe 1 year of psychotherapy.
Oh, is that amazing?
Yes.
You would have to get 1 year of psychotherapy to get hormones that are natural to your body.
In the meantime, I think you should go back on estrogen for your health, and then take some psychotherapy. And here he goes to his printer and he prints out a blogspot list of gender therapists in the Bay Area. And I'm going to say this guy's name because this guy, I mean, this is all true facts, and I'm not saying anything to really, nothing that is slanderous at all. It's completely truth.
Well, it's important for people.
His name is Madeline Deutsch, and he's at UCSF.
It's really important for people to know this, because if you have someone who's vulnerable and sort of feeling like they made a mistake and wanting to you know, revert back to their, you know, physiological hormones, and they are and they see a doctor like that who's just going to, you know, undermine their efforts to be healthy.
Yes,
that's really disturbing. And
there I was in my sort of hypermasculine phase of looking like a man, trying to looking like a regular guy, and you know, just trying to be making a case for myself to get testosterone. And yeah, he said, you should have estrogen now, and here, go see one of these gender therapists for at least 1 year before we talk about this.
Wow. Again,
about testosterone. Yeah, so his name is Madeline. I don't know what his real name is, but he goes by Madeline Deutsch. He's at UCSF. He wrote UCSF's trans guidelines, which are the most disastrous crock of shit you ever saw. He recommends that anybody that works in any kind of clinic is eligible to prescribe lifelong hormones, including what he actually said these words: nurse midwives.
Wow.
Why nurse midwives? And he said naturopaths. Like,
really?
why the hell did a naturopath want to do this? He said naturopaths and nurse midwives, physician assistants, anybody at the doctor's office could put you on lifelong hormones.
Wow.
That's in UCSF's trans guidelines, even now.
And to me, that's just, I mean, first of all, it's actually really interesting about, I think 3 videos in when I started this channel, and I had about 3 videos up, somebody messaged me and said, I was just in a psych unit for depression, and there was a transgender nurse, and I wanted to get the hell out of there because I thought the crazy person is trying to treat me. You
Right,
know,
right.
here you have somebody who's impersonating something, and everybody's going along with it. And this guy was like,
Yes,
"Why am I in the psych ward?"
yes. The classic thing is, how men who claim to be women are always inserting themselves as deeply as they can into women's space. They want to have anything that's exclusive to women, they
Mhm.
have to be allowed in there. In fact, they have to be in charge of it. And that is exactly what happened with this person. He is somehow, I don't know if he's the head of the women's health department, but he is the lead doctor at some women's health clinic, and masquerading as a woman.
Wow. And I have such, I mean, I have a lot of compassion for people when I feel like they are legitimately suffering from, mental health issues. But when you have someone who is what looks to me like a predator, who is
Hmm.
taking advantage of, a social acceptance of this kind of behavior in order to insinuate themselves into spaces where people are vulnerable,
Hmm.
or, to, as you said, to become the head of a woman's health department,
Hmm. Hmm.
taking over opportunities for women
Yes,
when women just have just started to get these
yes,
opportunities.
yes,
I really, I struggle with having compassion.
yes, because it's autogynephilia. The
Yeah.
thing about autogynephilia is it's a precursor to gender identity disorder. I don't think gender dysphoria exists. It's a gender identity disorder.
I
That's the
agree.
process.
Yeah, I agree.
And and the autogynephilia is like a precursor to it, in which there's it's actually more about the identity and injuries to the identity than it is about masturbation and
Mhm.
the erotic thing. That's there too. But
Mhm.
after a certain point, especially after the hormones kick in and you have less libido and so on, it's the identity disturbance. And that's why they freak out at being misgendered. It's just absolute fear that they're being exposed.
Mhm.
And it's very telling that the term validation, being valid or invalidated, whatever, this is taken directly from the literature on personality disorders and borderline. This comes straight out of there. So they don't even realize they're situating themselves within that framework, which exactly they are. I don't think it is borderline per se. It's a kind of identity disorder with serious borderline traits, narcissistic traits, histrionic traits,
Mhm.
and so on, that
Well,
is
and
its
it's
own
a
entity.
disorder that's being reinforced. Like
Yes.
when I was a kid, if my school psychologist said, "Oh, well, of course you're a boy. You can
Hmm.
go into the boys' bathroom," I would have been
Hmm.
like, "You bet."
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes.
and the more that the more I got validated with that, the more I got that reinforced. Then if somebody challenged that, I would be like, "Hey, no
Hmm.
way." And I
Hmm.
think that's what's happening. Um,
Yes.
what would you suggest? I have connection with lots and lots of parents who are really struggling right now because there's sort of been a lot of research, well, not a lot, there's been some research on girls and rapid onset gender dysphoria, and sort of the underlying causes for
Hmm.
girls. There has been very little for boys, and these parents are
Hmm.
reaching out to me and saying they have boys who have these gender identity issues, and they're getting no compassion because
Hmm.
everybody says, well, your son's just an autogynephilic pervert.
Hmm. Hmm.
And these are boys who, I don't know that they are autogynephilic. I think that the rapid onset gender dysphoria that these boys are having is actually quite similar to girls. And it reminds
Yes.
me of what you said with your past trauma and having male role models and wanting
Hmm.
to escape themselves as the sex that they see as a violent, and just wanting to distance themselves from that. But what would you say to these parents who are
Yeah.
so just heartbroken and aren't finding support?
So there's, as you know, there's um, boys and girls have different pathways to come into this, and with girls, of course, it has to do with body image and perhaps having been assaulted or raped, or just feeling very uncomfortable about men talking to them or looking at them, touching them, and or just staring at them and so forth. And with boys, they don't really have that, and and it's sort of like, why then do they both? Are we having rapid onset gender dysphoria in both sexes? And I think what's happening with boys is there's emerging feelings of eroticism that are hard to understand. Because I remember when that happened with me, and at the time I was 14, 13 or 14 when I first had any notice, like, what the hell's going on here? But I shifted it into a kind of a gear. So I already had my feeling of, I don't want to be a man, I wish I was a woman, blah, 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 since several years. And even, you know, dressing up in women's clothes at age 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. But the first time suddenly I had an erotic feeling, I transferred it into that frame of mind. I'm like, oh, well. So it was like autogynephilia was secondary in my process, but it quickly latched into the erotic form, you see? And so that was that was very confusing to me, right? So I don't know. I don't think all boys have trauma that get into this. But what we have now that's very different than it was when I was young was we have wall-to-wall nonstop talk about how it's normal and fine to change your gender. And that it's easy to do. All you have to do is talk to your guidance counselor and they'll set it up for you. And really you're on the way. And so I would hesitate to say that autogynephilia is the reason for it. 'Cause I mean, on the whole, I agree with Blanchard and his whole thing with autogynephilia, but I think there are some loose ends that he did not explore. I think he did good work, but I think there are some areas he didn't explore that maybe are exceptions. Or maybe, you know, he has this categories of, well, then in that case, you're a gay boy or something. Well, I wasn't a gay boy. And I was, for several years already, you know, had this ideation. One thing that was consistent with my process of transing myself, and what others have told me who now have detransitioned that was consistent with them, is after learning of the possibility of changing gender, which in these young people's case, it was through school and social media, etc. In my case, it was through finding the internet, having the internet at home for the first time and reading all this stuff. So through hearing that it's feasible, if they've then had hurt feelings or a feeling of disenfranchisement where they feel, I just want to hide, or I don't want to talk to my friends anymore, they were mean to me. My parents grounded me and I didn't deserve it. He or she broke up with me and I'm really heartbroken now, in teenage romance, or any number of other things that could make a young person feel hurt. That is the entry point for trans ideation, because then you feel like, I don't like myself. I don't want to be me. I want to be somebody else. And if you've ever seen any of these kids in the ruminative process, now I remember my process, and it was very enlightening to see Stella O'Malley's documentary 2 or 3 years ago in Britain, where there was a family with a daughter heavily into trans ideation, and they showed this little girl, 13 or 14 years old, incessantly looking at the internet, pictures of these women who had taken testosterone, posing with their muscles, watching these transition timeline videos on YouTube, shopping or fantasy shopping for all kinds of masculine gear and so forth. And that was very enlightening to see this little girl's process, because it mirrored what I had done many years earlier of just reading all these stupid GeoCities websites and tripod websites of the early internet with these transvestites talking about how fantastic it is to be transgender and how to get around your doctor and all this stuff, which at the time I didn't think I needed it because I was just going to take
It's sort
herbs,
of like it just
but anyway, so the
introduced
ruminative process was just so intense.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit, and I don't know if I'm dating myself or if you remember this, but at the back of comic books, sometimes they had ads for, you know, becoming big and strong.
Yes.
And I remember looking at those, and I knew they weren't meant for me, but boy, I thought, I know, I could do this. I could do this. And I think about that thought process, which was, it was so much harder back then because I had to like
Yeah.
figure out how to get the money, and then I had to
Mm-hmm.
send away for it. And then it turns out it was a scam.
Yeah.
These days, it's not a comic book. You don't have to
Mm-hmm.
save up your allowance to get scammed. You
Mm-hmm.
just walk down to a clinic and get these
Mm-hmm.
drugs. I mean, to me, the
The
fact
other aspect of it for the kids too is that they're all highly trained in role playing.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
all their lives they've been on computers and boxes of various kinds playing other people.
right.
And so the idea of being somebody else and using certain characteristics is sort of they've been well trained in that.
Right.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned something that, again, I respect Ray Blanchard's work, but I also know that he was looking at a very different population.
Yes.
We have just an explosion of boys now who are doing this, and it's,
Yes.
they're not fitting the profile. They're not,
Yeah.
they're kids who typically had felt fine until something happened. But I
Mm-hmm.
think about, the other thing that you mentioned, seeing your mom beat up by these guys, and how that might affect your ability to imagine yourself as a male being sexual with a female, because that would mean being this way, the way that these guys were.
Mm-hmm.
And I think boys these days see more and more examples of, of women being treated really badly, sometimes in
Yes.
porn, in
They
movies,
get porn nowadays
culture.
too. That's another aspect
Right,
of it. Yeah.
right. And so it's not surprising that these kids are really confused.
Yes.
One concern that I have is that there tends to be almost like a sympathy for girls who
Mm-hmm.
develop ROGD. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, they're recognized, though there's an underlying issue. They might have been abused. They might be gay. There are these, they might be autistic. Whereas for
Mm-hmm.
boys, there tends to be less sympathy. And yet I
Mm-hmm.
think that I believe that we're going to at some point find, like you said, these boys have had some kind of an inner wound that they're
Yes.
needing to escape from.
And so there, of course, many could have trauma, but I don't know. I really have no idea how prevalent trauma is. There's also the idea I explored a little bit that we can have trauma as infants that we don't necessarily remember.
Mm-hmm.
And in my debates on Twitter several years ago, with trans activist males, because my mother once told me that I had been hospitalized as an infant for febrile seizures, and I thought to myself that must have been very stressful as a baby.
Yeah.
I wonder if others have early hospitalized emergency experiences. So I asked 4 different guys in different times. 2 of them were in one conversation, and the other 2 were separately. Did you ever have any emergency hospitalization as an infant? All 4 of them said yes.
Oh, wow.
So it's possible that there's some kind of lingering weird separation anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And the literature on separation anxiety is mixed per se, but it's still possible that has some impact on boys. It's mixed in I think in girls it was shown that they didn't have separation anxiety from the mother to the degree that it would lead to mental illness later, but with boys it was mixed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that was one thing. But so without trauma, let's just say that their life has seemingly been fine up till now. As I say, I think it's the explosion of information saying that this is something that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just even sort of an ordinary type of hurt feelings that kids have, or misunderstanding, or feeling like I'm excluded from the gang, or we didn't get to go to the movies like we said we were going, whatever it was, something that gets them really set off, probably more serious than not going to the movies, but something that makes them feel very hurt feelings, along with all this other information. Maybe also not being a macho little boy, being just sort of sensitive, or like I was, where, because children's mental thought processes are not logical or based in anything except rumination, and whatever misunderstandings of information and lies they've been told. So
and it's
then
it's
that
really
kicks
sad
in.
to me, because rather than exploring all these possibilities, we are now just telling kids that they can be born in the wrong body.
Yeah.
and that they should self-harm, basically, that they should
Well,
engage in behaviors that are
there's
self-harm.
never been one never been one comparative study of psychological interventions. Never even been one comparative study of psychological interventions to alleviate gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, any of that. There have been many sort of single-arm studies. What I mean by that is a case series or even just case reports of psychotherapy or group psychotherapy or, or just a series of patients given psychological interventions, and they've gotten through it. Now, mind you, the last one of these was probably 25 years ago.
Wow.
Because the trans industry, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH, whose godfather was the charlatan Harriet Benjamin, believe that people actually are born in the wrong bodies, and there's no point in doing psychotherapy. And so because of that, they go from 0 to 100 miles an hour with just like, all right, we're transing you. That's it. It's the only intervention there is.
Yeah. So what recommendation would you give to a parent whose son suddenly assumes this trans identity and is insisting on, getting on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, and knowing the damage that that's going to do to that child?
So I think for all of us that have been through this, that we get to a certain level where we think we have to trans ourselves, it's a variety of personality disorder. I won't say what kind, but it is some kind of personality disorder. And I believe it is a kind of induced one, because the more you ruminate and then finally you split and the rest, it's all downhill from there. But it is a kind of induced personality disorder that can be resolved, as I have done and many of the detransition people have done. What that means is it requires the type of approach that you would take with a child who has a personality disorder. And that usually means dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other types of therapies along those lines. And I need to write something about this. I've gathered a ton of information. I've alluded to it a few times, but there are now what they call transdiagnostic processes in mental health, and they don't refer to transgender, but what they mean is, instead of saying, oh, you have borderline, I'm going to treat you like a borderline patient, they look at constructs within a range of different mental health conditions, such as rumination. And so they target the interventions at rumination. So what that means is targeting dialectical behavioral therapy at the rumination process, not at you're transgender or you think you have that sort of almost doesn't matter. This is sort of a side effect, not a side effect, but like a bit of fluff on the side. But the real question is you're ruminating until you're making yourself into not well.
Right.
So for parents with kids who are deep into this process, and mind you, I'm not a psychologist. I've never even taken a psychology class. I am sort of a self-trained epidemiologist, and I do know a lot about medicine and epidemiology and science, and I have a new appreciation for it. But I do know some things about psychology, and I know that dialectical behavioral therapy is a common approach for people with these sorts of thinking. The emergence of personality disorders mirrors in many ways the emergence of trans ideation. And they have these interesting diagrams in some of these papers on emergence of personality disorders, and you go, wow, it's almost the same exact thing.
Yeah, and that concept of rumination, I call it perseveration,
Yes.
that I learned because of the way I was brought up. I spent very much of my life perseverating about things that happened to me as a child. And it really was debilitating. And at some point, somebody said, you don't have to do that. And I was like, really?
Right.
Well, yes,
right.
I do. Yes, I do. Of course I do.
Yeah. Well, it won't be easy. You see, it won't be
Right.
easy. This is not something that you can just start any kinds of therapy and it'll be fine. Because these people do not want to be treated most of the time, at least the adults.
Yeah.
And they will resist it. And that's why personality disorders are hard to treat. And with kids, it's probably really difficult because you also need to be kind and loving and not tell them this is reality. You have to face facts. I mean, maybe there are some things that, I mean, it's hard to be a parent, even if you really know how to be a good parent. It's still hard to be a parent. And when you have something crazy like this pop up, I don't mean crazy, when you have something unexpected and dramatically difficult, it's really hard to do the right thing. But the first thing to do is avoid any sort of gender therapist,
Yes.
unless they know that the whole thing is a charade, and they're part of the resistance to the gender industry. Maybe it would be an anti-gender therapist, or someone who's. I mean, I don't know how to recommend, because I think you don't know. You can't just
You have
look
to
in
be
the phone
so
book.
careful. You have to be so
Yes,
careful. And because of the new
there. Yeah,
legislation that
yeah.
bans therapy in some places, a lot of therapists are just very hesitant to even delve into these
But
issues.
many are emerging. There are
Yeah,
many people emerging. I think as every year, there's just so many more clinicians of all kinds who are
yeah.
starting to see through this nonsense.
Right.
And so
Yeah, they're
I
out
would
there. You
say,
just have to be
yeah,
very careful and make sure that you do your homework before you take your child to somebody.
exactly. Yeah. And there's a new organization called the Society for Evidence-Based Gender
Yeah,
Medicine,
yeah,
which is over 100 clinicians from around the world who see through all this, and they want people to be helped. And maybe they can recommend
yeah,
people. And I know on Facebook there's some groups of gender critical therapists. I just don't know how to hook
yeah.
people up with this, but
But
there are ways
if
to.
parents have a sense of that it's that, that rumination, that perseveration, that thought
Yes,
process, that gets, it's almost like you get in a rut, and once your brain starts thinking about it, it's like it's hard to get out of that rut by
yes,
yourself. And then if you have society coming in and saying, "You're right, that thought
right,
that thought is completely valid, that thought's completely accurate," that's where it becomes a problem, because generally speaking, like when I was a kid, everybody was like, no,
mhm.
that's not accurate.
I
And
think another
so,
thing, just as sort of parenting, as sort of, how it is when your kid is just having tantrums and it's
mm,
really got some stupid idea that they really want to do, and it's not going to happen. We're not going to do that.
yeah,
Is take them outdoors. Just get out of the damn house. Go to the
yeah,
beach. Go surfing or body surfing. Get on a horse. Go
yeah,
for a long hike.
yeah,
Eat outdoors on the beach, or in the mountains. Really, just the more being in your body and get away from the stupid computer.
hmm,
And kids will see it as punitive. They'll complain and whatever. But no, you have to. We're walking 5 miles today. Come on,
yep.
you know.
Yeah, I would agree, because that gets you grounded and centered
Yes.
in yourself,
Yeah,
which
and then
is
just
so
sit there
important.
listening to the crickets
Yeah,
or whatever is happening. Just be present in the moment on the ground without your stupid phone, without
yeah,
any of that stuff. We're
yeah,
leaving the phones in the car. We're going for a long walk,
yeah.
and that's
And
it
you
for
will
the day. Bring food.
survive. Yeah,
That can help. I
yeah.
mean, my son, he's a good kid, but he had some bees in his bonnet that were just ridiculous, and I had to kind of like, we're not going to do that. You have to. Let's go
Yeah.
someplace.
Yeah. And I do think getting outdoors and just being present in yourself and doing something physical can be so helpful, because it takes you out of that thought process. It
Yes.
sort of, and which is so important. As we finish up here, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to?
So after I emerged into reality again and realized I'm just me. I'm not a woman at all. I'm just me, and I just have to not lie and not pretend to not try to make anybody think I'm a woman in any way. That's the way to be real. That's natural. And so I didn't really know. I didn't. I could not believe that they were trans in kids, and I read all this, the Radfin blogs. So I started up a blog of my own in which I began to expose the truth. I called it The Truth About Autogynephilia. And I was putting scientific articles and sort of my interpretations of scientific articles, and also exposing some of the lead trans activists and so forth. And so I thought by doing that it would be okay, but it wasn't getting a huge number of readers. So then I went on Twitter. My goal was, because I began to also understand that this was largely affecting young girls. And although ROGD had not been named, this was a process that was happening. And so I thought, I just need to put a stop to this. And I was not so concerned about like poor little me, people who detransition and so forth, you know, it's like I made my bed, I slept in it, and that's that, you know. But I just felt like I have to try to put a stop to this in any way I can, and so that's why I went on Twitter. I've been banned 8 times, but it seems to be an effective way to get information out.
Is that website still up? That you?
No, it was censored by the trans industry, so it's found on the Internet Archive though. You know, archive.org, they sort of archive everything, so
Yeah.
it's still there, but it's hard to get to, kind of. But anyway, I don't know. I just thought I'd mention that because you asked that question. I didn't actually answer it. So
Yeah, and I think I think it's really important for people who have experience with this to speak out, because this is damaging children. And you know, I have compassion for adults. I feel sad when adults hurt themselves, but I just feel like as adults, it's our job to protect children, and we're
that's
not
right.
doing that right now. And I feel like it's really imperative that we stand up and say, hey, this is not okay. And someone
Yeah.
like you who has experienced this and gone through some of these medical interventions can speak with a depth and sincerity that is so important, and that might reach some people.
I hope so. Do you know the website I put together called Stop Transing Kids?
I don't think I do. If you could send that to me.
Yeah, it's after the one that got censored. I made a new one. It's called Stop Transing Kids at wordpress.com.
Okay.
But I you know, people think Harry Benjamin was some nice old guy. He was a guy who was an utter quack from start to finish.
Yeah.
And so I have a whole article about who is Harry Benjamin, and several of the other articles I've written that are very inflammatory.
Good.
They're very inflammatory, and one that is rather scientific, but it was rejected by several journals because it was too truthful.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I think is most disturbing about this, is that it's getting increasingly harder for us to speak about our experiences, that you know, we're being silenced. People are having their Twitter accounts taken down, their Facebook accounts taken down. Billboards advertising Abigail Schreier's book are being censored.
Right.
This is, to me, extremely concerning. You know, we're entering into a phase of this ideology where it's considered violence to disagree with it and to speak out about it, and that's a whole nother ball of wax when we start censoring people's speech and telling them that if they don't affirm this this delusional thinking, that they're actually hateful and criminals.
Yes. In the old days, you know, when it was just mostly men who are just like out of their minds and they insist they have to be transsexuals, whatever. The doctors were mostly skeptical, and they did it anyway because partially as a sort of a curiosity, as a scientific curiosity. Also because it was seen as a new market, a niche market for psychiatrists and surgeons and endocrinologists. But many of them, or most of them, in their papers would write about these people are out of their minds, and we're just doing this because of they keep threatening suicide, and that's the only reason we're really letting this go forward. And so it's just remarkable to read the clinicians of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s up through the 90s even, and then suddenly it switched to like, these people are who they say they are, and you cannot question them. They are women inside. And to date, there has been zero scientific evidence presented that anybody who claims to be the opposite sex is other than psychologically disturbed.
Right.
That's
Or
all.
claims to be anything that they're not. I mean, generally speaking, when someone claims to be something that they're not, we acknowledge that that's, you know, a distortion in their thought process. And we try to help them with that if it's going to result in harmful behaviors, which, you know, having your testicles cut off is a harmful behavior.
It is. And it's a personality disorder that, you know, thankfully I was able to kind of recover. And I should mention that, you know, stopping estrogen had a dramatic effect on me. And others have pointed out, other clinicians have pointed out in the old days, that estrogen in men is a mild euphoric and sort of an antidepressant.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why men like to be around women.
Mm-hmm.
We feel good.
Right.
And so I would say that while I was taking estrogen, it was as if I'd maybe had a glass and a half of wine or something, where I was just
Kind of feeling
always,
good.
maybe that's overstating it, but just in general, it was just like, all right, I feel calm, I feel good, you know.
It's a
And
drug. I mean, it's a
yeah,
drug. And that's what I've heard, that there's a testosterone high that
yeah,
women get when they
yes,
start taking testosterone. I mean, this is a
yeah,
powerful hormone. And
yes,
however, we don't tend to advocate giving drugs to people just to sort of make them feel a little better,
right,
especially when the drugs are harmful. I mean, you know,
right.
if your daughter came and said, I really want some heroin,
Hmm.
it'll help me get through the day. Help me
Well,
feel
in Oregon, that's
happier.
okay. In Oregon, that's allowed now, apparently, but because
Yeah.
they legalized any kind of drugs you want to do, it's
Oh
fine.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but right, no, I mean, and especially with the minimization of the harms. I mean,
Yeah.
I could have looked at any time, but I just didn't want to. But
Yeah.
now they're told that. I mean, it's really striking to me that because estrogen has so many harms when you take it. I mean, such a risk when you take it by mouth.
Yeah.
Um, they're actually offering it to them to inject.
Oh
Now,
wow.
why would you? And also, the girls are still getting the injection because I
Right.
don't think they want to give them the gel because it's expensive or something.
Yeah.
But can you imagine in young people who are a little bit out of their minds to
Wow.
get them comfortable with needles
Yeah. The
at a
concept
time
of,
when
if
we
you
also
don't
have an
feel good,
opioid?
just give yourself a shot.
We also have an opioid crisis.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm used to it. It's okay. I can do it.
Yeah. Ugh. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I really appreciate it.
My
Uh,
pleasure. Thank you.